I'm going to be having a conversation with Emily Hedrick, and she's graciously agreed to talk to us about her story and what has brought her to be where she's at now. So welcome, Emily.
Hi.
So could you introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, okay. So I am a recovering ex-pastor and am currently working as a program director for Marlene Winnell's Journey Free, and also a religious recovery and spirituality coach and consultant for myself.
Wow, you do a lot of different things.
Yeah.
What brought you? Did you think that you were going to be doing this type of work?
No.
When you were younger.
No, I thought I was going to be a pastor for my whole life.
Okay. Like a pastor in the traditional sense.
Yeah, in the traditional sense. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So what brought you to come down this road that you found yourself on?
Yeah, well, I grew up in the Mennonite tradition, which my version of Mennonite is not as strict as some other versions. There was nothing about electricity or clothing having to do with my growing up. I was an ordinary kid. And when I was 9, I started having dreams about becoming a pastor and preaching, and I liked the idea of being able to read the Bible and tell people things about how to live their lives. And over time, I eventually decided that yes, this was what I wanted to do. I kept exploring in the church and getting more and more involved and having some good experiences. And so I ended up getting to a point where I started bumping up against people that did not believe that women should be pastors, to the point that it caused a bit of religious trauma for me. I didn't have those words at the time, but I am thankful that they exist now. I think it would have been very helpful to my 17-year-old self. But basically, in a moment of discipline, if you will, a conversation with my pastor at the time, I realized how vulnerable I was. My pastor had gotten me to believe that I was rebellious and leading the youth in the wrong direction and being just being a bad Christian and probably a bad girl. I won't say woman.
Because you wanted to go down a career track that wasn't okay in that.
Yeah. Yeah, to a certain degree. It was a little bit confusing, as those conversations can sometimes be. We were arguing about whether or not I could preach a sermon at the church, and it was decided that while women could preach, because every now and then women have to be God's plan B, that I couldn't because I had been bad. And it was very unspecific at the time, but the best I can come up with is that earlier in that time I had been engaging with curriculum for the youth group and called something out as guilt manipulation, and I think that might have been seen as a bit more rebellious than it should have been. And also I was using my leadership skills and had some bad run-ins earlier where I prematurely, for some people, wanted to get involved with church things, and leading at a young age is dangerous, I guess.
So you were a girl with some leadership skills.
Yeah.
Wasn't always accepted though, or seen as something that
right. Yeah.
Could
yeah.
Wow. What was it like being a 17-year-old? It sounds like you had a lot of passion, and you knew what you wanted, and you knew what you wanted to say.
Yeah, I cared so much. Church consumed my social life when I was involved in it. And so it was my identity in many ways. And it was how I coped with life. It was how I coped with growing up and being a teenager. That's hard enough. And so having the meaning of, I'm in church, we're doing these epic things. It matters on an epic scale. That's very, very appropriate for my super emotional teenage development. And so it really appealed. So to have that kind of shot down and basically said, you know, the things you're doing for the church, it's nice and all, but actually you're kind of rebellious, and we think that you're not doing this well, and there's something wrong, and you have sin in your life, you haven't forgiven people, all of that kind of, it just, of course I believed it. I believed it because it was coming from an authority figure that I apparently trusted. And also I didn't trust myself. And that was the biggest piece of it. I had grown up in a tradition telling me that I was born sinful, that I was going to have a tendency to want bad things, and that I was going to have to fight against that my whole life. And hopefully God will help me if I try hard enough and feel bad enough. And so in that moment, being accused of things like, well, you're not forgiving enough, you're not submissive enough, all of these things, they sounded familiar. It sounded like I did need to fall in line. And that came from that background theology of shame and guilt, and there's something wrong with you, just assume that you're wrong, okay? Like, it's very controlling.
Yeah. Wow. So then what happened after that?
Well, I grew up with a mix of that empowerment. My family was all for women being pastors and really encouraged me when I started to express interest.
Yeah.
And so having that put next to this controlling approach to religion gave me enough of the wherewithal to say a few hours later. It took a while. It took a lot of crying and confusion. And then having a moment of, wait, I don't think that stuff is true.
Okay.
But the thing that was really particularly disturbing about it to me, the thing that made my whole world fall apart, was the fact that I had believed it for a while. And this feeling of, oh my goodness, I didn't have control over my own belief system, over my own sense of reality. Somebody could just go in there and shape it for me. And that discovering that vulnerability was terrifying. I just didn't know who was trying to manipulate me when. And the other thing that's really distressing about church trauma, at least for me, was that nobody, or many people, do not consciously intend to do that kind of harm and to be that kind of controlling. It's just not conscious. It's surrounded by niceness and vocabulary like love and grace, and so it's just ever lurking. And I got into this space of just not knowing, who's the next nice person that's going to manipulate me,
right?
And
and the person manipulating you is also trying to measure up to the system's expectation of them.
Yeah.
For what does a good leadership do, or someone in leadership, how do they, lead in a godly biblical way?
Yep.
And then
there's lots of pressure.
Down, everyone kind of has this like pressure to uphold some kind of expectation.
Yeah, I mean, doing whatever you can to control someone so that they don't go to hell forever really does feel loving if you believe that.
Right.
Like, it's just...
So even doing unloving things can be framed as the most loving thing you can possibly do.
Yup. Yeah, it's a little twisted.
Wow. Okay, so then you graduated from high school.
I graduated, yeah. And I got to a point where, so there was a mix of responses to my experience of having this, oh God, I'm vulnerable, what the hell? And one of them, from most of the people that I trusted outside of that particular church setting, was, hey, don't give up on God just because the church did some crappy things. Okay? Like, please keep your belief. Please don't give up. Okay. And some of that, I think, is genuine concern. There's also, since I've been a pastor and burnt out and left, I feel like there is a little bit, especially with the church as it is at the moment. It's dying. People are afraid of, at least the white mainstream church, and people are afraid of the church losing relevance, which they've been afraid of. This, look into history, it's everywhere. But seeing a potential pastor, especially if you believe that women can be pastors, lose faith at 17 is like devastating to the marketplace potential of another leader that you can grab and use in your system. And so I also see a little bit of that story. Oh no, we can use you though. Don't leave.
Right.
And again, all couched in really truly loving intention. So I ended up getting this story in my mind that I had to work on my relationship with God, and if I couldn't make my relationship with God better, I was a bad person. And so when the grieving and angering process came up of figuring out what to do with this newly discovered vulnerability and the grief of, wow, my religion isn't safe, and it was the thing that was bolstering me for so long, and I've lost my foundation for feeling safe in the world. I felt guilty about feeling negative things.
Okay.
And
you shouldn't have allowed it to get to this point, or
yeah, that's right. Like, how dare I go into another church that's different than the church I grew up in and not trust them either? How dare I not make myself vulnerable for whatever religious service I'm walking into? How dare I not give myself the opportunity to work on my relationship with God? What's wrong with me? Why can't I heal the way I'm supposed to?
So it all came back to, there must be something wrong with you.
Yep. Yeah. And it got to the point where the cognitive dissonance was so strong. I hated myself so intensely for being angry and sad that I started to think suicidal thoughts. And that was kind of the moment of reckoning for me, where I started to take stock and say, is this worth it? Is trying to improve my relationship with God worth this mental anguish in which I would rather just be dead? And that's when I decided to kill God. And that was, I still believed very strongly. I was also anxious constantly that I was doing the wrong thing in taking too long to heal. And so it got to the point where I decided I need to stop believing in God completely, because this is driving me crazy.
Okay. So would it be accurate to say that you felt that you needed to stop believing in God for your own mental health?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So what came of that?
It took some work. It took a few months, maybe 5 or 6 months of me. I would say it was cognitive restructuring for the most part. When I would go to pray, I would then try to catch myself and say, oh no, God doesn't exist. If I went to try to explain something with a typical religious theological approach to something, I would reframe it and say, nope, you can find another explanation. You can find a better one. Okay. You're in college. Go find some science.
What was that like to kind of open the door to other ways of explaining our experience in the world?
It was fun. And I happened to be doing it during college. So it was a really great space to do that exploration. And eventually, by the time that I got to the point that I could really, truly believe that there was no God and that there was better explanations for everything, I felt free. It was a strange experience for me, because most of what I was surrounded by was people saying, oh yeah, when you lose faith, it feels so terrible. Here, let me hold your hand. Let me be sympathetic to you. And I'm like, no, losing my faith was not the issue. Like, losing my faith was the most healing thing I could have done. This is so exciting. Why don't we have a party? But everybody around me was like in mourning on my behalf.
Isn't it interesting how we're given a narrative and told this is exactly how your narrative should play out and the way that it should feel?
Yeah.
But deconstruction, we often realize, oh, it didn't play out that way and it didn't feel that way, and now it feels how it was supposed to feel.
Yeah.
In that narrative, out of the narrative.
Yeah, there were a few moments where I played around with using God language and conversion and things like that to try and say, oh yeah, my moment, I was saved when I stopped believing in God. And like having those twists and turnarounds as part of the story. Yeah.
Wow. So when was that? Was that when you were in college?
Yeah, I think I succeeded by the time I was 19.
Okay, wow. Yeah. So then, is this when you wrote the book?
Yes, this is when I wrote the book. And a lot of that was just because of all of the people coming up to me and trying to offer their support in a very dark night of the soul kind of way, and saying, oh yeah, sometimes you don't believe in God and you go through this dry spell and it feels terrible and you just don't have the motivation to be spiritual. I'm just like, no, I have too much motivation to be spiritual, and I believe too much in God, and it is causing me problems. This is not it. This is not my problem.
Oh.
And so I looked to try and find literature to inform what I was doing, because this is what you do when you're in academia, you research. And I found nothing. And so I started trying to come up with ways to document it myself. And eventually I came to the idea of, what if God could be a character that could actually be literally physically killed? And what if I can explain my experiences of vulnerability and harm in physical terms? Because maybe then it would make the story at least emotionally more accessible to people that haven't experienced it.
Wow.
That's
amazing.
So
I want to read
yeah. So I wrote a little allegory that detailed my experience, and I discovered actually afterwards. So there are a few things that happened. One is that it does make God a physical character, and the main character just plunges a dagger into his heart at one point in the story. But the other thing that ended up happening during the time I experienced so much cognitive dissonance that it was like I had different perspectives happening in my head at the same time. Sometimes I would talk to myself out loud to try and sort through what was going on, and get into arguments and start yelling at myself. And in the beginning I was like, do I have demons? And then over time I came to the conclusion, no, I think all of these voices are me. I think every single one of them is me.
Wow. What
and so
that
yeah,
you talk, you have inner knowing.
Yeah. So I ended up in the book actually having my character go through the experience of splitting into these different parts, and having the parts talk to each other and having to do work with integrating. And I didn't find out until after the book was published that internal family systems is a thing.
I was
like, oh. Yeah, nobody told me that internal family systems was the thing, though I didn't really talk that openly about it. I thought I was a little weird for talking to myself literally, and responding. So
we have these different parts that are always connecting with each other.
Yes. And ultimately, this is probably spoilers, but ultimately what I learned was that God, the image of God that I had been holding, was also a part of myself. And that seems to fit with things that I have learned over time. A book that I read, and I'm going to forget the author, but it's called When God Talks Back. And it's an anthropologist goes into a vineyard church and studies them and becomes part of the church for her study, and talks to them about what the experience of talking to God is like and hearing from God is like. And ultimately, and I'm not going to be able to quote her directly because it's been years since I've read this book, but the concept I took with me is how God, she evaluated God to function. And she does not claim the existence of God in one way or another in her work. She's looking at it as an anthropologist. But one way that it could be described is that talking and hearing from God is a skill that is taught. And it's basically about designating a portion of the mind, the cognitive processes, to be God. And I think that it really does make sense in that sense of, even in internal family systems, which I have not studied, but have experienced a few times, and done on myself apparently, that God does become part of the conversation to a certain point, if you are taught the skills to label it that way. Yeah. So anyway.
So that's how socialization plays into all this.
Yes.
Right? If you're socialized to interpret these parts in a certain way, then of course you're going to interpret it.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people that find these approaches to religion functional, that God voice that is curated and cultivated can be very loving and kind. I think in my experience, it ended up just getting very aggressive and violent and mean. And I think that's the case for a lot of people that end needing to leave.
Right.
God becomes a tyrant and an abuser as a result of the theology.
Yeah. Have you maintained a form of spirituality in life since?
So that's the interesting thing. I had been working on it when I was in college, actually. At the same time that I killed God, I had also gotten into conversations with mentors about spirituality and whether or not I could still have a sense of spirituality. And I did do a lot of work in recognizing that. In the beginning, it looked like doing some Jungian dream interpretation, actually. And that was a lot of fun. And the way I interpreted that was, dreams may or may not actually be sent from God, but they can start a conversation. And as I went into ministry, so in grad school, I felt very safe. I loved my master's program, my master's of divinity. And that's because questions were fine. It was fine to not believe. And a lot of it was helpful for the deconstruction process because education is a key component of getting out. And so instead of having this limited information of you have to believe our beliefs, you shouldn't be reading anything by anyone that says differently or even takes a scientific materialist view to religion itself, including the Bible, form criticism, contextual criticism, all the different kinds of biblical criticisms are threatening to someone that wants to take it literally. So learning how to do all of that in grad school in order to write ethical, well-researched sermons is really helpful for a person that's trying to take these things apart. Like, oh, this Bible was not all written at once. It's a library, and there's a lot of human involvement and cultural impact on what's going on in this text. It was very helpful for my deconstruction journey. But, oh goodness, I forgot where we were going with this. Spirituality. Yes, so in grad school, I did develop a bit of a spiritual practice. I started experimenting a little bit with mindfulness, I guess I'll say. At the time, I didn't have a name for it, but just paying attention to my body. I had realized that my body was not part of the conversation because it was bad. And learning to listen to my body was a huge part of learning to trust myself again. And so I had started a practice of just paying attention to my body. I had wanted to be able to meditate and tried to sit still and couldn't. I was achy. So I started stretching and just saying, oh, what does my body want? I'm going to do that. And eventually over time, I had in some semblance developed a stretching mindfulness yoga meditation practice for myself. And then when I became a pastor, I stopped completely. And I believe that that was because as a pastor, I had to be in spaces where people believed I believed in God, and that was inherently not safe. And I could not do spirituality for myself when I was not safe. And so it cut off. So now I've been out of the ministry, the pastoral ministry, since the end of January, so February, March, about 9 months, and it's just starting to come back.
Okay. Is that exciting?
Yeah. I'm more curious about it at this point. I'm still a little bit like, I really love talking to other people about their spirituality, which worked well when I was a pastor. But finding my own I'm still making sure I'm safe, because I've had this whole process of, like, it's almost cycle of abuse of, oh, I have spirituality. No, I can't have spirituality. I'm not safe. Oh, let's go back. Let's go back into the not safe situation and try and do this again and make you vulnerable again. And it's just, so getting to the point where I can tell myself, no, this time I, adult Emily, am going to take care of you. And that's still developing.
Right. Those inner parts are still having that conversation. Are you sure?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
I'm sure. But that takes time.
Yep. It does. It does.
Yeah, totally. So what are you doing now?
So right now,
ministry, you're where you're at now.
Yeah. So right now I'm working as a religious recovery coach and consultant. Marlene and I have discussed the necessity. Coaching often focuses on the individual as the expert and having just a very question asking type of relationship, which is good and can be very helpful in developing self-trust. But for a lot of us that have been through violent religious communities, there is some education that needs to happen as far as what religious trauma syndrome is, how it works, what are the mechanics of indoctrination, what are the patterns of violence at play in different religious settings and communities. And so, and also just to have someone say, hey, you can trust yourself and what happened to you is not your fault. All of that is really important part of the process. And so that goes a little bit into the consulting realm. But then there's still coaching when it comes to the questions of, well, what now? And you are the expert on what works for you in your healing process, but let me give you these resources and give you this information and help guide the new discoveries that are happening.
Okay. Wow. So you're doing that. And you also mentioned working with Marlene Winnow. Can you tell us a little bit about that organization and what that is?
So Journey Free is Marlene's business that she's had for quite a few years, and it houses a variety of different things. It has a release and reclaim support group, so releasing toxic religion and reclaiming the things that were good within it for ourselves. And that support group meets twice a month, and it's just an ongoing thing that happens with that. So I do some facilitation with that. Then there's also individual consulting. And so some of my coaching goes under that umbrella, consulting and coaching.
Okay.
And then the new thing that we're developing is something called Religious Recovery Boot Camp, which is basically a 5-month program in which we will learn about religious trauma syndrome and how it works. We will work with the trauma-informed practices of building body awareness and developing a trigger management system just to pay attention to, okay, what are the things that make me feel not safe and what are the ways that I can cope with the anxiety, including bringing my body into the conversation. And then also providing space for people to tell their stories in a safe group setting and learn from each other. So that's going to be a really powerful program, I think. And we're starting our very first one. It's the beta one. So we're still testing things out, but so it's at reduced rates at the moment in January. And yeah.
Wow, that sounds like a great program.
Yeah, it's going to be, it's going to be a really good thing, I think. And just what I've seen from the Release and Reclaim support group is that just connecting people with others who have gone through the process of being indoctrinated and then leaving is so powerful, just to know, oh, I'm not alone. And yeah, I guess this wasn't my fault.
Yeah. It can be so powerful to realize, wow, I have other resources. I have people who have actually been through this road before.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing. That's wow.
I appreciate you having me on.
It's so neat to see like where you've come from and how that's informed what you decided to do as your vocation. Yeah, really exciting. If you were to give advice to people who are earlier in their journey, what would you tell them?
I'd say it's really tempting to try and find external sources of validation. And if you can find them, great. But ultimately, what the most necessary part of the process is finding your own voice and learning and establishing that self-trust process. And whatever that takes is good. I ended up writing a book about killing God. There may be other forms of that, whether it's creative expression, writing music, doing art of varying kinds to get in touch with that sense of self, and anything to do with listening to the body and reconnecting with the body is so important in the healing process. So yeah, it's okay and actually really good to trust yourself on this. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for all the wisdom that you've given today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right. All the links that Emily talked about will be in the episode notes. And so I really encourage you to check it out. And yeah, thanks so much, Emily.